But otherwise, I think this is a very helpful and lucid clarification of much of what I was trying to get at in the lecture, particularly my anxiety that cognitive science of religion is too preoccupied with kind of weird stuff and spooky beliefs. It doesn't need to be, but it does much of the time seem to tilt in that direction.
Welcome to this discussion of the Boyle Lecture for 2024, given by the very Reverend Professor David Fergusson, and with a response from Professor Fiona Ellis. My name is Niels Gregersen. I'm the president of ISSR, the International Society for Science and Religion, and we are part of organizing the Boyle Lectures. We also make the YouTube available that everyone can see on the website now. And also we are inviting to this discussion afterwards. So it's my pleasure to welcome here, of course, first of all, David Fergusson, and no least Fiona Ellis, the respondent. And I also want to say a special welcome to Joanna Leidenhag and to Russell Manning, who will be actually posing questions to David Fergusson in a while. But I think that, given the fact that Fiona Ellis actually made a very interesting response, also about what explanation means and so on, I think that I would like to give first of all the word to you, David, before we then perhaps a response from Fiona, and then we go into Russell and Joanna. So, David, what do you think about what Fiona Ellis said to your lecture?
Thank you very much indeed, Neil, and my thanks to Fiona. Her response is really very generous and friendly, but it does offer some helpful philosophical clarifications. So I think we're basically agreed on the danger of perceiving religion as adding one more object to the stock of objects in which we believe. I used the example of Bertrand Russell's celestial teapot, and she alluded to Nicholas Lash's Loch Ness monster type of theology, where God is located as a kind of super sensible object outside of the world up there. And we put forward a series of hypotheses
This is a call for incoming passengers from
support of that. So I think that's a mistaken way to conceive of religion and what people are doing when they practice religion. It's to do with ritual practice, coming together, the way people create patterns of meaning in the world, and to that extent, it's compatible with what Fiona calls an expansive naturalism. It's as much about how we live in the world and how we see the world in a certain way, in a way that resists an exhaustive material explanation. This can take a variety of forms, but I think it's at least as much a way of life than it is a worldview or an intellectual hypothesis. Where I might sort of probe further is whether there's scope for images of the transcendent on this view. If we have an expansive naturalism, can we still employ symbols for depth and for transcendence in order to articulate the ways in which, as she says, following William James, we're substantially suffused into a much greater reality than ourselves. So I'd want to leave open space for images of the transcendent as well as those of depth. But otherwise, I think this is a very helpful and lucid clarification of much of what I was trying to get at in the lecture, particularly my anxiety that cognitive science of religion is too preoccupied with kind of weird stuff and spooky beliefs. It doesn't need to be, but it does much of the time seem to tilt in that direction.
Thank you, David. So you raised a really important point, and it's really important to an understanding of the kind of expansive naturalism that I want to defend, that I get absolutely clear about this, because sometimes it can seem as if you're an expansive naturalist, you want to reject the very idea of the transcendent and espouse a kind of immanentism that excludes the transcendent. And so this is a really important point. I want to say that expansive naturalism is a way of accommodating the transcendent rather than reducing it to the immanent. And what I mean by that can be understood perhaps by going back to the problematic dualistic framework that I was talking about, where you've got on the one hand the natural world, which is understood in very narrow terms, and then on the other hand you've got all of the spooky items, including the transcendent and God, etc., that are forced outside of the natural world. And as Hegel would put it, on that kind of dualistic picture, you end up finitizing the transcendent, or God, because God becomes just one more finite measure, situated in the second supernatural realm and set apart from anything natural. So on that kind of dualistic picture, there are no prospects for accommodating the transcendent, because the transcendent and the immanent, if you want to put it in those terms, cannot be comprehended in those finitized dualistic terms. So the alternative picture, the alternative non-dualistic picture, allows that the natural is much more expansive than that dualistic picture would have us believe. It has no outer boundary, and it can accommodate the transcendent for precisely this reason. So the transcendent is not an extra finite measure in addition to the immanent. It is a dimension of the immanent. And I take it that that's what David wants to say, and that's what any sensible theist would want to say. So this long-winded answer to the question of whether I can accommodate the transcendent would be, this is the only way of accommodating it, because you end up with a conception of the natural world which is wide enough to allow that somehow we're part of and fused into this infinite reality that has no boundary, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much to both of you. It's a very interesting discussion about naturalism and also about transcendence, how it's located or how it's thought through. So thank you very much for the two responses. I would like now to give the mic over to Russell V. Manning as the first respondent to David Fergusson. Please.
So thank you. I mean, it's firstly an honor, a pleasure to respond to David and indeed to Fiona's response. And I think I really just wanted to raise in my brief remarks now just a couple of points, really, and one of which I think is actually going to take up something of what Fiona was just alluding to there about that lovely phrase that what any sensible theist would want to say, and I'm going to do that through the lens of one of the questions that David raised about the persistence of religion, persistence of religious belief. And I think it's interesting that David referred to the new atheist moment and referred to the sense in which that's to some extent already somewhat old hat, past its out of date in some respects, and referred instead to questions about the discussions around spiritual but not religious. And I think I would just want to perhaps suggest there that set of discussions might also be somewhat past its time. And it's interesting to refer to recent work of Linda Woodhead, who, from a more sort of sociological, I think, broadly perspective, kind of questions the extent to which that narrative of spiritual but not religious is still sustainable, particularly within the British context. And instead, she notes the rise of the nuns, the none of the above, those who profess no religious affiliation, no religious commitments whatsoever. And I think here this raises an interesting question, a different sort of challenge, perhaps, here to this question of the naturalness of religion. A question, an approach, perhaps, that refuses to take the question seriously, if you will, that refuses to have any engagement with the seriousness of religion, that unlike the new atheists, unlike the spiritual but not religious, unlike the theists, sensible or otherwise, the nuns are indifferent, shrugging their shoulders about the question of the naturalness, or indeed and the truth or otherwise of religion and religious practices and commitments. And so I think that raises an interesting set of questions that sort of perhaps move us beyond this question of the theist atheist framing of these conversations into one perhaps more of a sort of seriousness or absence of seriousness. And I think there I want to suggest again that we might refer to, David mentioned at some point, Karl Rahner talking about that sense of the unconditioned. We might, of course, also add to that reference to Paul Tillich and that sense of orientation towards ultimate reality, that sense that each of us has some sense of some sort of ultimate concern, however that may be expressed, and that might move us, in Tillich's language, beyond the God of theism. So from a kind of skeptical perspective, but also perhaps from a more an attempt to get through to what it is that's supposed to be the sensible bit in the sensible theism, which is how I think I would characterize Tillich's approach there. So question, sort of perhaps slightly shifting the framework of the question there about the naturalness of religion, if that makes any sense. And then my second set of kind of suggestions that I want to bring here is relating specifically to David's discussion of the cognitive science of religion. And I mean, I very much welcome his reflections and his kind of critical, very gentle at times, but nonetheless sharp critical reflections on the enterprise of the cognitive science of religion. Of course, a very differentiated set of approaches. But I think he raises some very important points in the extent to which the cognitive science of religion does tend to focus on those beliefs and practices that are too weird, and also those that in some sense are too basic, rather kind of uninteresting religious practices and commitments. Instead, in some respects, I think he's right to draw us attention to the ways in which religious beliefs and practices are perhaps more normal. It's certainly mediated, embedded, so less weird in that respect, but also at the same time perhaps more counterintuitive, and so perhaps more interesting in that respect than some of those beliefs and practices that tend to form the focus of discussions in the cognitive science of religion. So I think that that's very welcome. My kind of question, I suppose, is where, if we take that sort of approach, might we wonder whether religion is really the right object of inquiry here? What would happen if we shifted the focus from a cognitive study, scientific study of religion, to a focus on theology, precisely that second order reflection that might be a closer parallel to the science that David was drawing there. What would a cognitive science of theology be like? And might that be a more interesting and more productive sort of set of questions? So I said I would raise those sort of two areas, and so I've got a number of other things that I would obviously like to throw into the mix, but I said I would raise two, and so I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much, Russell, and please, David.
Thank you, Russell. And these are comments that deserve more thought than I'm able to give them at the moment, but let me offer a couple of reactions. Yes, spiritual but not religious, is that now becoming rather quaint to the extent that people who say they belong to no religion are less likely to say that they're spiritual, or not so many of them are likely to say that. Is it really just that we're faced now with mass indifference, particularly amongst younger populations with respect to religion? I mean, I think there is a lot of indifference out there, and there's no point in pretending otherwise, though how local and provincial that is would be one question to explore further. And I mean, I come back again to the point that Ian McGilchrist has been making forcibly in his latest book, or 2 volumes, The Matter with Things. And he says if you ask people whether there is more to reality than can be described by material patterns of description, 95% or more of people will say yes. So to that extent, the nuns and the indifferent are not subscribing, I think, to a materialist philosophy or ideology. And if you push them a bit harder, they will tend to suggest there's more to it than is capable of being described in terms of material forces. I think many people look to art or the arts rather than institutionalized forms of religion for a sense of depth or some experience of transcendence or ways of making meaning in their lives. David Brown's explored this in a series of volumes where he attempts to discern a natural theology in a whole variety of practices, dancing, sports, gardening, as well as in the visual and performative arts. So there might be something worth talking about there. Is religion the right object of inquiry? What about theology? Yes, in some ways, I want to shift the inquiry back towards theology and to an intentional reflection upon what we're doing in religious practice. My colleague Tim Jenkins has written very critically about the cognitive psychology of religion, and his view is it tends to treat us more like animals in terms of the way that we're addicted to certain drives and impulses. Whereas if we look at the distinctive ways in which we're human, then other patterns of description and evaluation need to come into play. And he reckons that's kind of division between those who want to speak up for the humanities and others who see everything in terms of the sciences. So to that extent, I'm keen to make theology part of this conversation, and that's one of the reasons I'm in favor of having a bit more theological reflection on what's going on in this area of the study of religion today.
Thank you very much, David. And I just want to ask you, Fiona, if you have any second thoughts, particularly on the issues raised by Russell.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was really interesting what you said, Russell. And I was thinking about the points you made about the nuns as opposed to spiritual but not religious. I mean, I'd always taken them to be kind of equivalent. But I think you were suggesting, or maybe Linda Woodhead suggesting, that the nuns are more like Nietzschean nihilists. And you know, that's a really interesting point for me, because I mean, some of the recent work that I've been doing involves a study of a kind of Nietzschean nihilism, where it involves being indifferent in the sense that you're kind of incapable of desiring or incapable of having spiritual experiences, if you want to put it in this register. But you know, I don't think the nuns are like that. I don't think that they're indifferent to everything, and that I'm just looking at my notes for the precise words that you used. They have no spiritual commitments. I think that they don't want to commit to God, and they're indifferent to God as they understand God. But I don't think they're nihilists. I mean, maybe the nuns that I've come across or thought about don't correspond to the entire class of nuns, but it's an interesting question. Are they Nietzschean nihilists in this sense of nihilism that I've just characterized, where you're just indifferent and you can't desire anymore, you can't be spiritual? Or is it just that their commitments have gone beyond a certain understanding of theism, or theism as they understand it? It would be really interesting if they were nihilists, but I don't think they are, but maybe some of them are. Yeah.
Thank you very much, all three of you. And I now want to pass on the torch to Joanna Leidenhag. And you kindly asked me if you had to stick to 5 minutes or could go a little beyond that. And I think you can and should go a little bit beyond of that. But of course, we have a limited time frame here. So please, Joanna, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Niels, and for the little bit of generosity in the time. Let me add my thanks to David for this lecture and comment on the honor it is to be considered amongst Professor Ellis and Dr. Manning as your respondents. So I want to start off by admitting that I've actually never been a very big fan of this question, is religion natural? And that's not because I think it's uninteresting. I think it's very interesting, but I've kind of concluded to myself that quietism or silence might be the best theological response. And those who know me will know that I'm a fairly gregarious evangelical, so they might be quite surprised by this admitted quietism. So I want to structure my response by giving 4 reasons that I have been quietist about this issue. But I also want to start off by noting that perhaps more than any other take-home point from David's lecture, he has gone some way in convincing me that this is a topic that a theologian maybe could engage with profitably, and that doing the hard work of grappling with the various dimensions of this question might be worth doing if it's done well, as he has done for us. But let me explain my prior skepticism about engaging this topic at all. So the first reason, expressed eloquently and insightfully in Professor Ellis's response as well, is the realization that much in this debate depends on the definition of the quite undefinable terms of the question. So the concepts religion and natural are not only difficult, they're not only multifaceted or historically contingent, they're not just open concepts that we can like point to examples but not give sufficient and necessary definitions for. They're not even just family resemblance concepts with fuzzy boundaries, or maybe they're not just terms invented by secularism and so to be treated with a measure of suspicion. I think the situation with the terms natural and religion is worse than any of this that I've already said. I think natural or nature and religion are what philosopher W.B. Gallie called essentially contested concepts. Religion and nature, what essentially contested concepts means is that religion and nature are normative concepts, but they're normative concepts that admit no one authoritative definition. And that's because all parties agree and recognize that there's a variety of legitimate meanings here on the table. And they agree that resolving this variety or establishing a shared definition is something that cannot be done by providing evidence or logical argumentation. Instead, there seems to be something permanently intractable about disagreements on the proper use of the terms religion and natural. As David points out, the way much of cognitive science of religion operationalizes these two words is to refer to religion almost exclusively as just the weird stuff. And this is further cause for theological dismay. So such a situation tempts me, first of all, to a kind of exasperated and exhausted quietism on this question. The second reason that I haven't much enjoyed this or joined in with this area of debate is the lingering feeling that the question, is religion natural, is something of a trap for the theist. As Professor Ellis outlines, if we answer no, then the intellectual climate dominated by naturalism will take this to mean that our colleagues are licensed to provide quick dismissals of religion. On the other hand, if we answer yes, as David has done, then as he points out, we risk inviting reductionism and claims that religion can be explained away. As David notes, such conclusions, such reductionist conclusions, are often presupposed rather than demonstrated, such that, therefore, empirical evidence seems to make little or no difference to the ultimate metaphysical debate as to the truth value of religious beliefs. Whether answered yes or no, then, responding to the question, is religion natural, seems to leave the believer in a worse position than which she started. Again, this situation pushes me towards a more prudent or considered form of quietism. As a quick aside, since I've got my extra few minutes, I thought it might be interesting to note that not all agnostic naturalistic philosophers do take this reductionist line in response to the naturalness of religion. And I thought as an interesting counterexample here is J.L. Schellingberg's 2019 book, Religion After Science. So Schellingberg is the famous author of the argument from divine hiddenness against the existence of God. But he argues in this 2019 book that from the perspective of deep time, the human brain should be considered woefully immature, and that we should expect cognitive mechanisms for divine detection to improve considerably over the next 10,000 years. So his plea, mostly aimed at the religious nuns he addresses in this book, is that religion is a far more difficult topic than science. And so whereas we've reached a suitably evolved state to make scientific progress, we may need to wait another 10,000 years before we should expect progress on religion. I don't fully agree with this argument, but I wanted to offer it as a highly original and creative perspective on this otherwise well-worn topic. But for now, let me return to my reasons for quietism. So the third reason that I'm hesitant arises out of my own current research project, which is on autism and theology. So in brief, many of the main theories in cognitive science of religion, such as the hyper-agency detection device, the counterintuitive concepts, and the theory of mind mechanisms, have argued that we know religion manifests through these cognitive mechanisms because autistic people, apparently, are impaired in these mechanisms and tend to be less religious. So that's often the logic within cognitive science of religion. And yet, autistic people clearly are religious, can be religious and deeply spiritual, at least to the same extent as non-religious people, and with the same level of variation. Reasons for lower attendance in institutionalized religion, according to poll data, are more likely explained by social factors, sensory factors, and linguistic differences than they are by cognitive or affective differences. And I think that leading theories, therefore, in cognitive science of religion have yet to consider autism seriously and holistically, And if they do, they will find that autistic spirituality provides important counter-evidence to current thinking, as well as offering new avenues for research. That is, I remain hesitant to endorse contemporary cognitive science of religion because I worry that it stands on shaky foundations of neurotypical normativity that need to be revised. And I don't know how the field of cognitive science of religion will look after this revision has taken place. Finally, my final reason for quietism is just the culmination of the previous three. After the hard work of giving definitions to these essentially contested concepts, carefully surveying empirical evidence that seems to make little difference to debates, and worrying about ableist foundations of the scientific endeavor, I want to throw my hands up in the air and ask, what was the point of all of this hard work anyway? What's really at stake in the question, is religion natural? Why should we care? And to this, I think David has provided a very innovative answer that is the reason that I started off with appreciative comments that he might have moved me on. And that's that the naturalness of religion allows us to contextualize the apparent decline in traditional institutional religion in a way that provides comfort and challenge to contemporary churches. It provides comfort because it counteracts the secular hypothesis that religion is inevitably fading, but it also provides challenge because what David has done is provide us with a prediction, surprisingly for a theologian, perhaps even a testable hypothesis, that religion is unlikely to disappear so much as be refracted in the future. The thing about predictions is that they inform contemporary behavior. And so the challenge I think David has offered to the church in his prediction is that churches should attend to and cultivate engagement with places where humans' natural religious tendencies are popping up outside of institutional boundaries. He points to the Green Movement. I might also point to the persistent interest in ghosts, seances, and the popularity of the horror genre across the arts. Insofar as the naturalist of religion does pertain to a perpetual factory of idols, in Calvin's words, as David notes, these are as likely to be found within institutional church bounds as they are outside of them. And for this reason, I want to suggest that we urgently need neurodivergent people in our churches to help our natural religious tendencies to be corrected, because different mechanisms and biases will be in place there. But perhaps what I appreciate, and this is my very final comment, perhaps what I appreciate most about David's lecture is how he's shown me that this whole debate can be linked to a more deeply theological picture of God and God's grace that surpasses and fulfills our natural capacities. His prediction does not merely lead to a kind of evangelistic opportunism about how to get a few more bums on seats, but it is a theologically rich picture of a God who rushes out of his house to meet the prodigal son, the Spirit who inflames the tongues of scared disciples, and he speaks of a grace that can still ambush and surprise us with a prayer that utters itself. So thank you very much, David.
And thank you very much to you, Joanna. And please, David, what do you think about quietism and also the cultural issues that Joanna brought up about what are the interests in speaking about natural religion?
Yes, thanks, Joanna. It's another very rich contribution, and I should spend much longer talking about your comments than I can at this stage, but let me offer a brief, quick set of reactions. I'm sure you're right that natural and religion are slippery concepts. There's a spectrum of meanings. They resist any essentialist definition. I recall giving a lecture on a similar subject to a group of scientists at the Royal Society in Edinburgh some years ago, and the engineers present were horrified that I couldn't give a clear definition of my leading terms, and that seemed to discredit what I had to say in their eyes. So I think it's important to admit at the outset that there is a whole spectrum of meanings, and that these are, if you like, open textured concepts, and there's certainly a spectrum of meanings that can be attached to them. I mean, why is it worth the candle? Well, most theologians and many philosophers have thought that religion is in some sense natural. I mean, Calvin, writing about the sensus divinitatis that all people have, Schleiermacher, Rahner was mentioned earlier. So it's been an important element in the history of theology. And to that extent, it needs to be reckoned with. And I also think in terms of the current state of the study of religion today, it's important that we stay in conversation with each other, with colleagues who are working in different disciplines on the subject of religion, and don't allow theology to become isolated or hermetically sealed. So I can see all sorts of dangers and pitfalls here, but I reckon it's still worth the effort. You're right that what I say might well be empirically disconfirmed. To take Schellenberg's thought experiment, if religion has pretty much disappeared in 10,000 years, then what I've said in this lecture will be conclusively refuted, though I'm sure the lecture will have long been forgotten before 10,000 years pass by. Dale Allison has an interesting book that's come out very recently that I need to engage more with on the prevalence of what he calls spiritual experience. He argues that once people are placed in the right conversational circumstances, about half of them will talk about some spiritual experience or other that they've had. And that I think is probably something I need to factor in to a greater extent in the material I have here. Your comments on autism are very important. I have the sense that much cognitive psychology, particularly in the late 20th century, tended to draw conclusions about the ways in which our brains were naturally adapted by drawing negative contrasts with the neurodivergent. And as you say, there are ableist assumptions that need to be exposed there. But what you say about the spirituality of people with autism is actually very important here, because I think it confirms the point that we've already made, that religion is not primarily about believing in spooky or weird things. People with autism often have a heightened sense of spirituality when they enter a sacred place or are in particular surroundings. So rather than draw negative contrasts with them, we might actually learn more about what we mean by religion and the spiritual by attending more carefully to their experience. So I think that's a very important point, and it's one that I should think more about. I'm conscious of that I'm criticizing other people for misrepresenting religion, but maybe we theologians have misrepresented it and are guilty of some of these misunderstandings that are out there. So I don't want to sort of say that theology is squeaky clean in this respect. It needs to put its own house in order too.
Thank you very much to Joanna and David, and I will give free the words in just a moment. I just think it is interesting that both the terms religion and the natural are very elusive concepts, as also David has pointed to, but also that one can say that it is, in a sense, too much, that religion is not about beliefs or believing nothing or little or more, but also, for example, as Fiona pointed out at the end of her lecture, of her response, you simply said it's also about being decent. It's about being part of an ordinary life, rather than having some very specific ideas. And I'm not now arguing that we should not take cognitive issues seriously. I'm just saying that when I now hear also Joanna speak about quietism, I know that you do take cognitive issues very seriously. At the same time, one cannot take them all too serious, because we always know that it's also in the end about attitudes, how they how they go into our ways of approaching the world and the ways in which we are acting in the world. So I just want to take this as my little bring home message from what I heard here. There's much more to be said and asked about. And please, I wish to give the word free now for any question in relation to David, Fiona's, Russell, Joanna's, or others' view.
I see there are a couple of questions in the chat box, which I can come to, but maybe Fiona wants to say something before that.
I don't want to hog the discussion. I just wanted to say that I thought that Joanna's contribution was just brilliant, and it raises lots of interesting things, but I want to give a voice to other people as well, so I can come back if necessary a bit later.
Thank you very much. Very generous too. David, I have, are there any of the questions that you would like to take up from the chat here?
Yes, I mean, Jennifer Wiseman, thanks very much for your question. Yeah, I think what I was trying to say is that when we're dealing with the particularity of faith traditions, other types of question must come to the fore. And these involve more historical, textual, philosophical, and theological forms of inquiry. So the cognitive science of religion is not exhaustive as a form of description. So in the case of Christian faith and the resurrection, the example you give, what one would want to look closely at the texts, at theological readings of them, at arguments that have been put forward by exegetes and theologians and Christian apologists in order to assess there's a constitutive component of Christian faith, and one could say that about other articles of belief in Christianity and other religions. So I think that's right. It requires a different type of approach when we come to the particularities of our different faith traditions. Maybe a similar type of answer would be appropriate to the question that Timothy Manas has raised about the concept of the personal, or the category of personhood. I'm still quite enthusiastic about personalist philosophy, and I often come back to the Gifford lectures of John McMurray, who wanted to stratify the material, the organic, and the personal, and to show how the personal reposes upon the organic and the material, but nevertheless introduces new categories that require different forms of description and evaluation. The world of the personal is about freedom, love, meaning, and agency. This has to be evaluated in personalist terms and not reduced to the organic or the material. So if I've understood your question correctly, I'm in sympathy with what you're saying there.
Thank you. And I see a hand up here also from Joanna, please.
Thank you. A quick note on what David just said, because it's just, forgive me, it's my own current writing project, but it's interesting that McMurray's Gifford lectures also draw a negative comparison with autism. Now, obviously, his understanding of autism is to us very dated, just because of how old the Gifford lectures were. So it was using the best science of his time, but makes that same move. And yet, I do agree with David that I still have strong sympathies for his personalist philosophy as a whole, but we just have to be very careful in defining religiosity in CSR and defining personhood in personalist philosophy, that we're not doing it on the basis of a dubious ableist exclusion, which I think both parties, at least in part, have fallen prey to. And that's all I wanted to add there.
Thank you. Fiona, please.
Thanks. I mean, this links what Timothy was discussing or asking with one of the things that Joanna said, which I thought was really important, because one of the really important points that Joanna raised was, what hangs on all of this? What's really at stake here? And, thinking about definitions can turn into kind of a boring game where you're just doing a puzzle and nothing hangs on it, and you're just showing how clever you are and that kind of thing. But it has to be more than that. And as Joanna was saying that, and I was listening to David's response, I thought, you know, what really hangs on the question here of, you know, whether religion's natural is how we're to think about the limits of our natural human being. I mean, that's what I take to be the really important question here. And that relates to what Timothy was asking in a way, because when you talk about what the relation is between the personal and the natural, you can end up going back into this really weird, spooky kind of ontology. So God's a person, where that means God's a kind of spooky entity up there and different from anything down here. Whereas if you think about personal or persons in a more relational sense, so it's not that you're postulating kind of spooky entity, but raising a question about what it means to be a relational being, then one, you can link that up to the question of how we're to think about the limits of our humanity as natural human persons, but also link that up really naturally and easily to the question of God's being. You know, if you comprehend God's reality in these relational terms and treat God as a person on that ground, then I think you could solve a lot of different questions all in one go. I mean, in a way that some people would object to, I guess. But yeah, I think talking about persons and personality in those relational terms just makes it a lot easier to link these concepts rather than treat them in dualistic terms. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all of you. This has been a very interesting discussion, I think. And those of you who watched it on the YouTube channel, you will see that you can also see the older Boyle lecturers, Rowan Williams, Tom McLeish. And I also want to say that the Boyle lecture for next year will be the former Archbishop of Sweden, Antje Jacqueline. So we are looking forward to that, and I will be looking forward to seeing you all again. With every good wish here from the International Society for Science and Religion. Thank you.